And we are recording. The light clearly is not doing what I wanted it to do. But we have to make do. Because sometimes in life, things just don't work out like we want them to, and that is most of the time. You know, that's just a lesson I've learned after about 30-ish years. 30 years of being alive. So, I'm Carter Banks. You are tuning into the Carter Banks Hour. This is chapter 31 of Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This chapter is called Idols of the Marketplace. And without further ado, I'm gonna fuck with the lighting just a little bit more. Come on. I know you can. This is supposed to work. I spent a whole lot on these lights. Just light me. Just light me. Come on. It's too dark. Whatever. We're going bright with this one. You know, I may just have to fucking build a new set. This is like getting fucking ridiculous. Whatever. Trust the thing. What do they say? Trust the... Not the science, obviously. They say trust the... What's that? Trust the process. So we're going to trust the process with lighting here. Chapter 31. Idols of the Marketplace. An inner tension had built up inside him. Not an exhausting tension, but a joyful one. He could even feel the exact place where it was. In front of his chest, under the bones. The tension was pressing lightly on him, like warm air in a balloon, producing a sort of pleasant ache that was somehow even audible too, except that its sound was not of this earth, not the sort of sound that is heard by ears. It was a different feeling from the one which had sent him chasing after Zoya during those evenings of recent weeks. That feeling had not been in his chest. It was in a different part of his body altogether. He carried this tension inside him, nursed it, and listened to it constantly. He now remembered he'd known it as a young man as well, but then completely forgotten it. Finally, we're back to that chapter where he's like remembering that he was with Zoya as a child. Fuck, this is so good. I'm so pumped for this. Back to the book. It was a different feeling from the one which had sent him chasing after Zoya during those evenings of recent weeks. That feeling had not been in his chest. It was a different part of his body altogether. He carried his tension inside him, nursed it, and listened to it constantly. He now remembered he'd known it as a young man as well, but then completely forgotten it. What sort of feeling was it? How lasting? Might it not be deceptive? Did it depend entirely on the woman who had aroused it, or did it depend also on the mystery inherent in not yet being accustomed to the woman or intimate with her? Mightn't it completely disappear lately? But the expression to become intimate with had no meaning for him now. Or did it? The feeling in his chest was the only hope he had left, which was why he preserved it so carefully. It had become the chief fulfillment, the chief adornment of his life. He was amazed at what had happened. Vega's presence endowed the whole cancer wing with interest and color. The only thing that stopped the cancer wing withering on the stem was the fact that they were friends. Still, Oleg saw her quite seldom, and then only for a short while. A few days ago, she'd given him another blood transfusion. They had another good talk, although not as free as the last one because this time there was a nurse present. He had done everything he could to get out of this place, but now the moment of discharge was approaching. He felt sad about leaving. In Ushtarek, he would no longer see Vega. What would happen then? Today was Sunday. the one day on which he had no hope of seeing her. It was warm and sunny. The air was still, ready to be warmed up and overheated. Oleg went out for a walk in the hospital grounds. He breathed in the thickening warmth, which seemed to knead his body. He tried to imagine how she would be spending this Sunday. What would she be doing? His movements were sluggish nowadays, not as they once were. He no longer strode firmly along a straight line that he had marked out for himself, turning sharply whenever it came to an end. His steps were weak and cautious. Every now and then he stopped and sat down on a bench, and if no one else was there, he stretched himself out along it. This was how it was today. He dragged himself along, his dressing gown unbuttoned and hanging open, his back sagging. Often he would stop, throw back his head, and look up at the trees. Some of them were already half in leaf, others a quarter of the way out, while the oak trees hadn't broken into foliage at all. It was all so good. Unheard and unnoticed, a mass of bright green grass had pushed its way up. In places it was so tall that it might have been taken for last year's, if only it hadn't been so green. On one of the pathways open to the sun's glare, Oleg spotted Shlubin. He was sitting on a wretched-looking, backless narrow plank bench. Perched on his thighs, he was so twisted that he seemed to be bent backward and forward at the same time, his arms stretched out and his interlocked fingers clasped between his knees. Sitting there, head bowed, on the lonely bench in the sharp lights and shadows, he looked like a monument to uncertainty. Oleg wouldn't have minded joining Shlubin on the bench. He hadn't yet managed to have a proper talk with him, but he wanted to because the camps had taught him that people who say nothing carry something within themselves. Besides, Oleg's sympathy and interest were aroused by the way Shlubin had supported him in the argument. They're talking about this argument they had like a little ways back. It's in the last chapter, I think. His interests were aroused by the way Shlubin had supported him in the argument. However, he decided to walk past him. The camps had also taught him that each man had a sacred right to be left on his own. He recognized this and would not violate it. He was walking past, but slowly, ranking his boots through the gravel. Stopping him would be no problem. Shlubin saw the boots, and his eyes followed them up to see whose they were. He gave Oleg a look of indifference, implying no more than the recognition. "We're from the same ward, aren't we?" Oleg had taken 2 more measured steps before Shlubin suggested to him in a half-question, "Will you sit down?" Shlubin was wearing a pair of high-sided house shoes, not the ordinary hospital slippers that just hung on your toes. It meant he could go outside for walks and sit outside. His head was uncovered. On it, a few tufts of gray hair were sticking up. Oleg turned toward the bench and sat down, giving the impression that it was all the same to him, whether he sat or walked on. But come to think of it, sitting down would be better. However their conversation began, he knew he could ask Shlubin one crucial question, and the answer would provide the key to the whole man. But instead he simply asked, "So, it's the day after tomorrow, is it? Alexei Filipovich?" He didn't need an answer to know that it was the day after tomorrow. The whole ward knew that Shlubin's operation was scheduled for then. The important thing, though, was that he had called him Alexei Filipovich. No one in the ward had yet addressed the silent Shlubin in this way. It was spoken as though by one old soldier to another. Shlubin nodded. "It's my last chance to get a bit of sunshine." "Oh no, not the last," boomed Kostoglotov. But looking at Shlubin out of the corner of his eyes, he thought it might as well be the last. Shlubin ate very little, less than his appetite demanded. He was preserving himself so as to diminish the pain he would feel after eating. But this undermined his strength. Kostoglotov already knew what Shlubin's disease was. "So it's decided, is it?" They're diverting the excreta through one side, he asked him. Shlubin compressed his lips as though about to smack them, then nodded again. They were silent for a while. Whatever you say, there's cancer and cancer, Shlubin declared, looking straight ahead of him instead of at Oleg. There's one kind of cancer, beats all others. However miserable one is, there's always someone worse off. Mine's the sort of case you can't even discuss with other people. You can't ask their advice about it. Mine's the same, I think. No, mine's worse, whichever way you look at it. My disease is something specially humiliating, specially offensive. The consequences are terrible. If I live, and it's very big if, simply standing or sitting near me, like you are now, for instance, will be unpleasant. Everyone will do their best to keep 2 steps away. Even if anyone comes closer, I'll still be thinking to myself, you see, he can hardly stand it. He's cursing me. It means I'll lose the company of human beings. Kostoglotov thought about it for a while, whistling slightly, not with his lips, but through his clenched teeth, absent-mindedly letting air out through them. Well, it's hard to work out which of us is worse off, he said. It's even harder than competing over achievement or success. One's own troubles are always the worst. For instance, I might conclude that I've led an extraordinarily unlucky life. But how do I know? Maybe yours has been even harder. How can I judge from the outside? Don't judge. You're sure to be wrong, Shlubin answered. At last, he turned his head and peered at Oleg with his disturbingly expressive round bloodshot eyes. The people who drown at sea, or dig the soil, or search for water in the desert don't have the hardest lives. The man with the hardest life is the man who walks out of his house every day and bangs his head against the top of the door because it's too low. Anyone want to take a wild guess what kind of cancer Shlubin has? I think I know, and it's pretty fucking terrible. Whew. As far as I can gather, you fought in the war, and then you were in the labor camps, is that right? Yes, and a few more things. No higher education. No officer's commission, exile in perpetuity. Oleg listed the points thoughtfully and uncomplainingly. Oh yes, and one more thing. Cancer. Well, let's call it quits about the cancer as regards the other things, young man. Who the hell's the young man? I suppose you think I'm young just because I've got my original head on my shoulders, or because I haven't had to get a new skin. As regards to the other things, I'll tell you something. You haven't had to do much lying. You understand? At least you haven't had to stoop so low. You should appreciate that. You people were arrested, but we were herded into meetings to expose you. Oh, this is so interesting because what I'm gathering, Shlubin was a prison guard that put Kostoglotov in prison or a labor camp. So it's like he's meeting his foe, but they're both, in the cancer ward. Fancy meeting at the cancer ward. They executed people like you, but they made us stand up and applaud the verdicts as they were announced. And not just applaud. They made us demand the firing squad. Demand it. Do you remember what they used to write in the papers? As one man, the whole Soviet nation arose in indignation on hearings of the unprecedented, heinous crimes of... ... Do you know what as one man meant for us? We were individual human beings, and then suddenly we were as one man. When we applauded, we had to hold our big, strong hands high in the air so that those around us and those on the platform would notice. Because who doesn't want to live? Whoever came out in your defense? Whoever objected? Where are they now? I knew one. Dima Olitsky. He abstained. He wasn't opposed. Good heavens, no. He abstained on the vote to shoot the industrial party members. Asterisk next to party members. In November 1930, several leading Soviet scientists and economists were sentenced to death as wreckers for working for a counter-revolutionary industrial party. The party was, in fact, non-existent. Their trial was one of the signs of the coming Great Purge. Okay, so to give context, there's two things going on here. One, it goes directly back to, well, they're both historical fact. I'll give you an example of just using the Gulag Archipelago as a starting point. In the book, The Gulag Archipelago, that Solzhenitsyn wrote, there was a scene, I think, where they had to clap for Stalin for 11 minutes, and the first person to stop clapping was one of the party members, like one of the high-up party members on stage. And people were like clapping, clapping, clapping. People were passing out, clapping. And this guy was like, this is getting fucking ridiculous, and I am tired, and somebody's got to lead this coup of non-claps, otherwise we'll be sitting here fucking clapping forever. And so this guy stopped clapping, and he was like shot the next day, definitely executed, even though like literally somebody had to stop clapping, otherwise everyone would have clapped. And I think that there's a quote in there, he's like, we would have clapped ourselves to death. But this guy stopped. He thought like, well, I'm high up enough to stop this clapter, and so he stopped and was summarily killed for this. But also in the Gulag Archipelago, a lot of the, I think it was like the engineers, one of the things they had them doing was like digging this river. They had sent them out to Siberia to basically build by hand something that you required fucking tools for. And they had gathered everyone up, and if you were an engineer of any kind, you had this double-edged sword of like, if you can't make this work, you're a wrecker, which means that you're purposefully trying to sabotage the success of whatever they're trying to build. So you're like doing it badly on purpose, and you know better, so you're also like double guilty. So anyway, when they say wreckers, to give a modern day example, that would be like if I was like making music or something and I was recording everything overtly clipping, so I had to keep recording it, but I knew I was making it really loud. Like, why is this taking so long to get right? Why does he keep having to retrack everything for this song? He knows that it's too fucking loud, and he's doing it on purpose. So the music sounds bad and it's taken forever. So that'd be like wrecking in music production. But anyway, extremely large tangent. Back to the book. Explain, they shouted, explain. He stood up. His throat was dry as a bone. I believe he said that in the 12th year of the revolution, we should be able to find alternative methods of repression. Ah, the scoundrel. Accomplice, enemy agent. The next morning he got a summons to the GPU, double asterisk next to that, the Chief Political Administration, one of the many names held by the Soviet security police during its history. And there he stayed for the rest of his life. Shlubin twisted his neck and turned his head from side to side. In that strange motion of his, bent both forward and backward, he sat on a bench like a large bird on a perch it wasn't accustomed to. Kostoglotov tried not to feel flattered by what Shlubin had said. Alexei Filipovich, he said, it all depends on the number you happen to draw. If the position had been reversed, it would have been just the opposite. You'd have been the martyrs. We'd have been the time servers. But there's another point. People like you who understood what was happening, who understood early enough, suffered searing agonies. But those who believed were all right. Their hands were blood-stained, but then again they weren't blood-stained, because they didn't understand the situation. The old man flashed him a sidelong, scorching glance. Who are these people? The ones who believed? He asked. I'm going to have to finish that next time because I got so incredibly wrapped up in telling stories and lighting. But we'll do chapter 31, part 2 next. Tomorrow. Yeah. At 9 p.m. Central Time. Oh, wow. Pro Tools just cut out. Well, that seems like a fitting time to stop then.